Pedro, you're from
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the session, Feeding the Future, Securing Regional Food System. This is a topic that has been historically at the center of the Med dialogue. Today, we had also a high-level ministerial dialogue on this topic. One of the reasons is that this year, the combination of extreme weather, poor harvest, and the war in Ukraine, including disruption in international food trade, has created a deterioration in availability of food, access to food, and a price crisis. In the last couple of months, prices started to decline, but the situation remained deteriorated, and the unnourished and the people that is at risk of access to food security is growing, especially in North Africa, Middle East, and in Sahel. How can we build more resilient food system? How can we reduce dependence on imports, especially in Africa, North Africa, and Sahel? And how can we prevent the next food price crisis? This is what we're going to discuss with our panelists that I thanks and welcome, starting with Antonio Pedro, who's acting executive director at the UN European Commission for Africa. Then we have Roberta Gatti, chief economist at Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and Maximo Torero, who's chief economist at FAO. Thanks, everyone. And Maximo Torero, I would ask you to help us set the stage with a few numbers just to give the exact idea and the picture of what's happening currently.
Sure. If you let me, there will be, let me stand up better because it will be difficult for me to see what you are seeing.
Sure.
Okay, so it should be here. Okay, great. So I just wanted to give you a brief idea of the story and to try to understand what is happening with the countries that we are discussing today. So essentially what we see, the dark blue line is the world. And then you have Northern Africa, which have been increasing in terms of production, but there has been a decline in the last period. And then you have Near East, which have been facing a decline over the period, which worries and creates a concern in terms of per capita production. But the major concern is the trade dependencies of all these countries. And in green, you have the world, and this is the share of GDP in total food imports as a percentage, and you have the MENA countries and the global average. And as you can see, the dependency of Yemen is enormous relative to an average of the world percentage of dependency. And many of the countries depend substantially in terms of imports from the world. Not only that, when we look at the dependency specifically for Ukraine and Russian Federation on imports, and this is wheat imports, you will find countries like Lebanon that depend more close to 80% in terms of the imports between Ukraine, mostly from Ukraine, and from Russian Federation. But many of these countries had a huge dependency, which makes their resilience very complex when you shut down one of the major suppliers of wheat exports in those countries. Now, what are the production constraints? The production constraints first is water. And water is extremely complex. And as you can see, the line in blue is defining the where fossil water is being mined. And all those countries to the right-hand side are facing significant challenges in terms of water. And this brings the concept of how we can improve significantly water efficiency and the major concerns that we are facing in the other countries in the world. Now, there is ample availabilities of fuel and fertilizers in some of these countries, but self-sufficient ratios of fertilizers are displayed here, but there are countries that are not self-sufficient and depend also on the input side, and the input side, the prices are increasing significantly later. Now, the nutrition consequences of all these are complex. And we see clearly in this region a double burden of malnutrition, where you will see on one side significant prevalence of undernourishment, especially in Yemen, Jordan, Iraq, compared to the world. But then you will also see a significant challenge of adult obesity, overnutrition. So it's undernutrition and overnutrition, which puts a significant challenge over the region. And that's something to explore very carefully, how we can put policies through social protection that will help to minimize those risks. And why it's so complex? Because this brings non-communicable diseases. And especially in the case of diabetes. This is the level of diabetes relative to an average of the world that these countries are facing, which are significantly over in the case of diabetes. And that's all. So that's basically the situation that we are observing. So just wanted to help and bring some context to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you also for the way you presented it. Now, Antonio, Pedro, let's focus on the Sahel situation, because we know that there was a deterioration, not just this year, but it's coming from a very long time. What's your view of what can be done, and how are you at UN moving in that direction?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the views about the Sahel is that the Sahel is a land that is associated with conflicts, with the deterioration of all indicators, but at the same time is a land of opportunity. And this is where we're trying to invest as the UN family in changing the perceptions about the region, in understanding what are those growth drivers that can enable actors to harness all of that opportunity. So let's focus first on the issues, on the challenges. It's an area with some of the highest rates of fertility. So the demographic dynamics are very complex. You will see on average a young woman of 29 or so years old with 7 kids or so. So birth rates are very high, 2.9% or so, above the African average with 2.5. If you project that to 2050, Africa-wise, now we are about 1.3 billion people. By 2050, we are going to be about 2.5 billion people. If we do not invest into enabling that number of people to have better livelihoods, then the social challenge associated with people without livelihoods, access to decent livelihoods are very clear. More conflicts, migration, and so on and so forth. So I was earlier in the ministerial dialogue, and I was very happy with some of the messages that were conveyed. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, of Italy, made reference to joint responsibility. Investing in harnessing the potential in the Sahel is about securing sustainable livelihoods, peace and security for the rest of the world, including, of course, up north, because more migration upwards, more social tensions also upward. So what are the opportunities? The Sahel is equally a land with some of the highest levels of solar irradiation in the world. Mm-hmm. And with solar irradiation, we are talking about the possibilities of deploying solar energy to open up economic opportunities in the Sahel. Some of the countries in the Sahel, let's name Niger and Chad, have very high livestock. Chad has about 100 million heads of cattle. But these heads of cattle that could have potentially be part of very sustainable regional value chains are currently not being explored to the maximum because they can't have access to underground water. Massimo earlier made reference to the case of underground water in the north part of Africa. The same applies to the Sahel. They have very significant aquifers. You can only access it when you have machinery to be able to pump that water. With the deployment of renewable energy, with solar energy, and with advances in technology, now you can store energy in batteries with very, very high levels of 500 megawatts and above. India has, for example, solar plants of 2,000 megawatts or more. And with 2,000 megawatts now, it's not just about small boutique projects. With 2,000 megawatts, 500 megawatts, you can power industry, you can power cities, and with that, you can open up all the opportunities in the Sahel. Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of investments that the UN is considering. You have the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, which brings together all of the UN entities with a view to addressing some of the challenges that I've enumerated earlier, from the peace and security to development and humanitarian angle, so the nexus narrative. Mm-hmm. So we as ECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, we are more involved into the development pillar. We have produced a think piece, which is Sahel at 2043, which is a sort of a scenario analysis at looking at what are the kinds of investments that need to be made with a view for the Sahel to claim 2043, a land of opportunity. And some of those investments are indeed supporting more capital, human capital development. Human capital development is correlated to potentially better social livelihoods and so on and so forth. So that's what we are doing. We are also supporting countries to formulate their national economic diversification strategies. And this is to diversify from the dependence on the export of raw materials. Many of these countries, Chad, Niger, and many others, they are raw materials dependent countries. And those countries are exposed to the vagaries of commodity prices, booms and busts, and macroeconomic instability, structural adjustment programs, and restricted fiscal space. You have to open all of those up, spaces, and I'm sure my colleague on the side from the World Bank will talk about the importance of macroeconomic stability. We are investing more on the structural issues, long-term issues, productivity, and so on and so forth.
Just in a few words, but how urgent is it, given your knowledge of the situation that was introduced at the general level by FAO, but given your experience on the ground in terms of food security and the threats of a crisis looming?
Yeah, if you do not invest today in addressing those structural problems, it means that some of the things that we are seeing in the Sahel now, I mean, let me pick 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and what's the third one, where we've had successive cases of coup d'etats. And coup d'etat basically represents the social compacts, the relationship between the governed and the governors is being disrupted. So if we do not invest into addressing those structural issues, creating appetite for good governance, strengthening domestic accountability, it means that you'll have more and more of those situations. And that's instability. Instability means that all of that potential that I've mentioned earlier will not be harnessed. It means more migration, it's been more problems northwards.
Roberta Gatti, then it takes also economic policies to mitigate this effect and to prevent this to get worse. What do you see at the World Bank?
It does take economic policies, and let me pick up where Dr. Torero and Dr. Pero left it in terms of how the picture is looking like right now. So just a quick recap. High food prices, a sort of loosening up of this increase quite recently now, but still the forecast that food prices will stay high for 2023 and 2024. We all feel it, but the reality is that poor and vulnerable families feel it the most. And so a factoid that stays with me is that 2/3 of consumption of the poor is on food. So clearly, one needs to think about cross-sectorally about the policies for food security, but one that I would like to focus on right now is to increase the impact of social protection. And I'm talking about in humanitarian setup, about in-kind transfers or cash transfers, and in non-humanitarian setup, in development setups, about targeted cash transfers. This is very important because the impact of high food prices and worse nutrition, and Maximo has shown that the sort of double burden of poor nutrition on families and particularly on children in terms of undernutrition and stunted, but also of increasing rates of obesity, is something that carries long-term costs. And these long-term costs, they come from impacts that start in utero for a child, carry through the child health, and then translate into productivity in the labor markets. So to try to stave off the immediate impacts of this crisis, social protection systems are fundamental. Targeted protection systems in terms of cash are also the cheapest way to address that problem. So there is a fiscal bonus of expanding social systems of social registries and ways to target rapidly this money to the people who need it to avoid that a temporary crisis translates into permanent costs.
Absolutely. Maximo Torero, we know that there's a direct correlation between food prices and extreme poverty. And I think it was the World Bank that predicted that every 1% of increase in food prices means 10 million people go into extreme poverty globally. And you are managing and facing crisis after crisis after crisis. In the last 15 years, I think it was the third time that prices skyrocketed, and it was a mix of, weather and war. But is price the problem? Is access to food the problem? How do you see it?
So it's completely true what you are saying. So if we look at the crisis in the 70s, we look at the crisis in 2007, 2008, the 2011, and we look at the current crisis and abstract for a second about the bad things of the war. Okay, everybody agrees the war is terrible. But is the same problem happening? Essentially, one key exporting country reduce substantially their exports because of a shock. In this case, the shock is the war, before was weather. And why is this happening? Because every time we have that type of a shock, we will face the same problem on staples, on cereals. And it's because the world is highly concentrated in the exports of cereals. 5 countries in the world control most of the exports of cereals. And in this case was Ukraine and Russian Federation. So if we don't change that and we don't diversify that, we will never get out of it. So tomorrow it could be that there is a drought in Argentina or a huge drought in Brazil. We will have a similar problem of increasing prices and exacerbation of volatility. Now, the correlation with poverty, and in the middle you go through hunger, which is what we measure. We measure food insecurity and undernourishment, chronic undernourishment, and also acute food insecurity, which is more short-term, is huge. But let me give you an example that was kind of shocking and is linked also to the social protection problem. In Latin America, which is a continent that is a bigger supply of cereals in the south part, and also high-value commodities in the coastal countries of South America, Peru, Chile, Colombia are huge suppliers of high-value commodities. When COVID-19 shocked, you were expecting them to be more resilient to the situation. And what we observe a significant increase in poverty in all the countries with the exception of Brazil, and a significant increase in hunger to rates that we never expected will happen. And we measure severe food insecurity, which is equivalent to chronic undernourishment. Why Brazil didn't happen? Because of social protection. What Brazil did is they doubled immediately their social protection to the extreme poor, and they moved those people out of poverty. So even in 2021, the number of poor in Brazil reduced, but hunger was increasing. And why was that? Because of the informal sector. The informal sector in all these countries is huge. And with the lockdowns, these people didn't have economic activity. So they were people that were not poor and start to become poor. The other countries of the region didn't respond as Brazil. Poverty also increased, so you saw hunger and poverty increasing. In Brazil, we saw extreme poverty going down and hunger increasing. In 2022, Brazil, both things are going up. So again, the correlation is huge. Now, what to do is the question, how we change, and I think you were raising some of the issues, water efficiency. For us right now, we need to move in parallel. We need to cope with the emergency. That's improving the targeting of social protection and the velocity of updating, because nobody managing social protection programs thought of this informal sector and how this informal sector will be moved into poverty. If not, they will have coped with that. The second is to move in parallel in the transformation that you need. And for us, that's gaining efficiencies. We have to gain efficiencies as much as we can. Use technologies the best we can with science-based technologies, information, accelerating the efficiency in the use of soils. Many countries don't have, most of the countries don't have updated soil maps. We need, and we are wasting a lot of fertilizers right now, around 40 to 50%. We need to increase the efficiency in the use of water. And we need to use as much as possible information to target proper interventions that could significantly pay off so that we can move this transformation outside. So there are a lot of things that we need to move very quickly, being careful of sustainability at the same time.
Let me start with one that you just mentioned, how to diversify and reduce the impact of the largest 5 countries that export cereals. It will take also a different approach to agriculture policies and maybe more technology and more advanced approach to agriculture. What do you make of that in your experience?
Yeah, well, just recently, the African Union had an extraordinary summit in Niger, in Niamey, on economic diversification, on sustainable industrialization and economic diversification. There are a couple of key messages that came out of that. First, that industrial policy is not the business of ministers of industry alone. It requires multi-sectoral inputs and interventions beyond the Ministry of Industry. So it means that you have to invest in increasing your productive capabilities, that ministers of education, science, and technology have to step in with a view to ensure that education systems generate outputs that are in line with the market demands and so on and so forth. So, and some of the pathways to achieving Africa's sustainable industrialization and economic diversification included, indeed, investing in the agriculture sector, developing regional value chains. And if I can just go back to what Massimo said earlier, yes, indeed, what COVID-19 and the triple crisis have revealed is how vulnerable Africa is. is vulnerable because of its dependence on the rest of the world. I mean, during COVID, the world was closed, supply side disruptions. Africa doesn't have productive capabilities. We couldn't produce our own vaccines, and so on and so forth. But during COVID also, something interesting happening, which is the investments that were made with the view to promoting endogenous growth. So this is at the center of the discussions in Niamey during the summit. So, and endogenous growth is based on a couple of pathways. I've indicated, for example, the developing regional agricultural value chains. Different agroecological zones have been identified, which are take into consideration the climatic conditions. For example, in the north, and we were talking about the Sahel before, that's a region where we need to invest more into science, technology, innovation, with climate-smart agriculture, with the view to ensuring that we have seeds that are more resistant to the climate pressure and changes in temperature and so on and so forth. So this is what is happening on the continent. We've have center staged the importance of industrial policy, nel senso lato, which require addressing our major shortcomings, infrastructure. Africa is 54, 55 countries, depending on how you count it, and all of them are not linked. Then we have a series of barriers, tariff and non-tariff barriers, and this is where the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was recently adopted, becomes important. The African Continental Free Trade Area is about removing non-tariff barriers, promoting trade across different regions on the continent without all of those barriers. Africa's intra-African trade is about 16%. Other regions, Europe, is about 60%. In some regions in Africa, it's only 3%. It means that the countries don't have the complementarity between countries, very, very small. The European Union, most of the trade is really between the European countries. So those are the structural problems that really we need to address in the context of Africa. This requires also massive investments into understanding what is it that constitutes the national value proposition of each country. What differentiates one country from another? Earlier, I mean, Massimo, you made reference to the importance of a well-targeted investments. Part of that is about the profiling, to understand where and how you should invest. It's the quality of the conversations. Most of our productive sector is dominated by the informal sector. Our governments are more preoccupied into creating the so-called enabling environment for foreign direct investment. The conversations now, can they equally spend time into creating an enabling environment for domestic investors, including the small and medium-scale enterprises? Without that, we will have more social disruptions because the small and medium-scale sector is one that is ignored. It means doesn't benefit from the opportunities that exist in the market. More people going poor. During the last crisis, 55 million more people in Africa became poor. It means more tension, more confusion, more migration, and so on. And so
well, Roberta Gatti, some of these challenges comes from a very long time, so a very complex challenge. But what's the role that the World Bank can play in this? What's your approach to help, accelerating the response, especially to vulnerability to these crises that we know comes more and more often?
Thank you. This is a great question, but a tough one. So let me pick up on where Dr. Pedro left it, which is the importance of an enabling environment for growth. Growth comes from different sources. More people who work, more investment in infrastructure and in investment goods, more ideas. But things don't work so well if institutions don't work well. So if I reflect on my region, which is the Middle East and North Africa, I think the number one priority to move towards this sustainable path of growth is really to invest in governance and better institutions, more transparency, better investment in data, better way to sort of measure what works and what doesn't, and more aligned incentive to be able to course correct when needed. Now, this is a big picture story that I think applies to countries in different ways because their conditions are very different, but also applies on what we think about food security. Something that I think came across very clearly is that
separate. And that's why we need to move in parallel with not only mitigation, but also adaptation and trying to find ways in which we can produce more with less. And that could mean efficiencies. A lot of efficiencies gain can be obtained. I give the example of soils. 47